It's 10:30 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday morning at Jamaica Medical Center when a cry for help sends emergency workers rushing to the aid of two people.
They're screaming and they're carrying this woman. The woman who brought her in is saying they were driving towards the train station and they saw this woman laying there bleeding on Sutphin Boulevard. Very busy intersection in Queens.
Someone was lying. The story sounded simple enough. A woman had been found unresponsive, and the people who rushed her to the hospital insisted they were only trying to help. But within hours, detectives began noticing details that refused to fit together. The timeline shifted. Statements changed, and what should have been a straightforward investigation quickly became something far more troubling. Behind the carefully rehearsed explanations was a relationship few people knew existed. A relationship built on promises, secrecy, and growing tension. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized they weren't dealing with a random tragedy. They were uncovering a chain of decisions that had been building for months. Long before anyone was questioned, warning signs had already been ignored. Friends remembered conversations that suddenly carried new meaning. Small details that once seemed ordinary became impossible to overlook. Piece by piece, investigators began reconstructing a story that was very different from the one they had first been told. What they eventually uncovered would expose hidden loyalties, conflicting accounts, and a dangerous love triangle that changed multiple lives forever. Before we uncover how detectives unraveled the truth, please take a moment to subscribe. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue telling real cases with the care, accuracy, and respect they deserve. And if you're new here, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you to the community. On the morning of the 3rd of December 2013, staff at Jamaica Medical Center in Queens were preparing for another busy day when a woman was brought through the emergency entrance. The people accompanying her told hospital personnel they had found her in need of help and had driven her there as quickly as they could. Medical professionals immediately took over, assessing her condition and beginning emergency treatment. Their focus was on determining what had happened and whether anything could be done to stabilize her. But as they worked, something about the circumstances surrounding her arrival stood out. The explanation offered by the individuals who had brought her to the hospital did not answer every question facing the medical team. Because the circumstances were unclear, standard procedure required more than medical attention alone. Hospital staff notified the appropriate authorities so the events leading to her arrival could be documented and reviewed. At that stage, no conclusions had been reached. Investigators simply needed to establish a clear timeline and determine whether the information they were receiving matched the known facts. Officers began by identifying the people who had transported the woman to the hospital and recording their initial accounts. Detectives understand that the earliest statements in any investigation can be especially important. They often provide the first opportunity to compare witness recollections with physical evidence and independently verified timelines. According to those present, the events had unfolded quickly. Yet even during those first conversations, investigators recognized that several details needed clarification. There were unanswered questions about where the woman had been, when she had last been seen, and exactly how she came to be transported to the hospital. At that moment, the investigation remained in its earliest stages. Detectives were not searching for a motive or building a criminal case. Their priority was much more basic: establish the facts, verify the timeline, and determine whether the accounts they had been given accurately reflected what had taken place. What initially appeared to be a medical emergency was now being examined with increasing scrutiny. As investigators compared the first statements with the timeline they were beginning to assemble, they realized that understanding the hours leading up to the hospital visit would be critical. Those early questions would shape every step of the investigation that followed. With the hospital's immediate response underway, detectives turned their attention to the people who had been with Sheryl Outerbridge before she arrived. As in every major investigation, the first objective was straightforward: identify the witnesses, document their accounts, and establish a reliable timeline. Among the first individuals interviewed were Devani Wilkerson and Fabian Richards, both of whom had been connected to the events leading up to Sheryl's arrival at the hospital. Investigators asked each of them to explain where they had been, what had happened that morning, and the sequence of events as they remembered it. At first, the statements appeared to answer the most basic questions. Both described a series of events that, on the surface, seemed to account for how Sheryl had been transported to the hospital. Detectives carefully documented every detail, understanding that even seemingly minor observations can become significant as an investigation develops. As the interviews continued, investigators began comparing the accounts against one another. They also examined the timing of key events, including emergency assistance was sought, was present, and how the morning's events had unfolded. It was during this process that detectives noticed details that did not align as neatly as they had expected. Some parts of the timeline appeared difficult to reconcile. Certain descriptions differed in ways that could not immediately be explained. While inconsistencies do not automatically indicate deception, experienced investigators know they must be examined carefully before any conclusions are reached. At this stage, detectives remained focused on verifying facts rather than making assumptions. Those early interviews changed the direction of the case. What had begun as an effort to document a medical emergency was becoming a more detailed investigation into the accuracy of the information being provided. Detectives recognized that establishing a precise timeline would be essential, and they understood that every subsequent interview, record, and piece of evidence would have to be measured against these initial statements. By the end of that first round of interviews, investigators had not yet determined exactly what had happened, but they had reached an important conclusion. Before they could understand Sheryl Outerbridge's final hours, they first needed to determine which parts of the story could be independently verified and which parts required much closer examination. For detectives, understanding the people connected to Sheryl Outerbridge quickly became just as important as understanding the timeline. As interviews continued and background information was verified, one name surfaced repeatedly: Malik Wilkerson. At the time, Malik was married to Devani Wilkerson. By all outward appearances, they were a married couple building a life together in Queens. But investigators would later learn that the reality of their relationship was far more complicated than it first appeared. Sheryl had come to know Malik before the events that brought the investigation to the hospital. What began as a personal relationship gradually developed into something much more serious. According to testimony and reporting presented later in court, Malik maintained a relationship with Sheryl while still married to Devani. As time passed, the lives of all three became increasingly intertwined. The situation was far from straightforward. Instead of existing separately, their relationships overlapped in ways that created growing emotional strain. Investigators later learned that Sheryl had spent significant time around Malik and Devani, and the three were no longer strangers connected by coincidence. Their lives had become closely linked, making it impossible to understand one person's actions without considering the others. People familiar with the relationships described an arrangement marked by shifting emotions, changing expectations, and unresolved tensions. While each person's perspective differed, investigators recognized that these dynamics formed an essential part of the case. They were careful not to rely on assumptions. Instead, they worked to verify the nature of each relationship through interviews, records, and evidence gathered during the investigation. As detectives assembled that picture, they began to understand that this was not a case involving people who had met only recently. Months of personal history connected them, and those connections would become increasingly important as investigators reconstructed the events leading up to Sheryl's final days. The focus was no longer limited to establishing where everyone had been. Detectives also needed to understand how these relationships had evolved, what conflicts had emerged over time, and whether those developments could help explain the inconsistencies they were already encountering. By placing the relationships alongside the growing timeline, investigators reached an early conclusion. The connection between Sheryl Outerbridge, Malik Wilkerson, and Devani Wilkerson was not a background detail. It was central to understanding the case. Before they could determine exactly what had happened, they first needed to understand the complicated relationships that brought these three lives together. By late 2013, the relationships at the center of this case had become increasingly strained. What had once been a private arrangement involving Sheryl Outerbridge, Malik Wilkerson, and his wife Devani Wilkerson was showing clear signs of instability. According to testimony and witness accounts presented during the legal proceedings, trust had eroded, emotions were running high, and disagreements were becoming more frequent. Investigators later learned that one issue in particular had intensified the tension. Sheryl had recently gotten a tattoo, a decision that prosecutors argued became a source of conflict within the relationship. Witnesses described Malik as reacting negatively, believing the tattoo reflected choices Sheryl was making without his approval. While people close to the case offered differing perspectives on the relationship, multiple accounts pointed to growing friction in the days before everything changed. Friends and family also noticed changes in Sheryl. Although she remained committed to her children and continued trying to move forward with her life, those closest to her later recalled that the relationship had become increasingly complicated. The stability she had hoped for seemed more difficult to achieve as emotional pressures continued to build. During the final 48 hours before she was taken to the hospital, investigators reconstructed a timeline using interviews, phone records, and other evidence introduced during the case. That timeline placed Sheryl in contact with Malik and Devani during this critical period. Detectives worked carefully to establish where each person had been when they were together and how their movements aligned with independently verified records. As the hours passed, communication between those involved continued, but many details would only become clear after investigators compared witness statements with the documented timeline. At that stage, detectives were not relying on assumptions. Every reported interaction had to be supported by evidence before it became part of the official case. The significance of those final 2 days would not become apparent immediately. Individually, many events appeared ordinary. Taken together, however, they formed a sequence that investigators believed was essential to understanding what happened next. Establishing that chronology became one of the most important tasks in the investigation. By the time detectives completed their initial reconstruction of the timeline, they understood that the answers were unlikely to come from a single conversation or one isolated event. Instead, they would emerge from examining every interaction, every movement, and every verified detail leading up to the morning Sheryl Outerbridge was brought to Jamaica Medical Center. That careful reconstruction would soon begin revealing inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. By the time detectives completed the first round of interviews, they had shifted from documenting a medical emergency to testing the accuracy of every statement they had received. The objective was no longer simply to understand what had happened. It was to determine whether the accounts they had been given could withstand careful scrutiny. Investigators began by placing every interview side by side. Rather than reviewing each statement in isolation, they compared them minute by minute, looking for points where the narratives overlapped and where they diverged. Experienced detectives know that small inconsistencies can result from stress or imperfect memory. But when those inconsistencies begin affecting the sequence of major events, they warrant much closer examination. Particular attention was given to Fabian Richards, whose account became an important part of the developing timeline. Detectives carefully documented his description of the hours leading up to Sheryl Outerbridge's arrival at Jamaica Medical Center, then compared it with the statements provided by the other individuals involved. They wanted to establish not only what Fabian said had happened, but also whether independent evidence supported each part of his account. Investigators avoided drawing immediate conclusions. Instead, they worked methodically, returning to the same events repeatedly to determine whether each version remained consistent over time. The more they reviewed the interviews, the more they recognized that several key details did not align as expected. One timeline suggested certain events occurred in a particular order. Another account placed those same events differently. Even the reported movements of those involved raised additional questions that detectives believed required verification rather than assumption. To remove uncertainty, investigators began constructing a detailed chronological timeline. Every confirmed phone call, every reported meeting, and every documented movement was placed into a single sequence. Rather than relying solely on memory, detectives sought objective points of reference that could either support or contradict the statements they had collected. As that reconstruction progressed, the investigation became increasingly evidence-driven. Detectives revisited earlier interviews, asking follow-up questions designed to clarify specific moments rather than broad events. Their approach remained deliberate and professional. They were not attempting to fit the evidence into a theory. Instead, they were allowing the verified facts to determine where the investigation should go next. With each comparison, the gaps between certain accounts became more difficult to ignore. Questions that initially appeared routine now carried greater significance. Why did one person's recollection differ from another's? Why were certain periods of time more difficult to account for than others? And why did some explanations seem to change as investigators requested additional detail? Those unanswered questions marked an important turning point. Detectives realized they had reached the limits of what interviews alone could establish. If they wanted to determine exactly what had taken place, they would need evidence that existed independently of personal recollections. The next phase of the investigation would therefore expand beyond conversations. Investigators began preparing to examine locations connected to the case, looking for physical evidence that could either support or challenge the timeline they had painstakingly assembled. What they found would ultimately determine whether the original accounts accurately reflected the events or whether critical pieces of the truth had yet to be uncovered. The first interviews had given detectives a working timeline, but they knew witness statements alone could not determine what had happened inside the Wilkerson residence. Before making any assumptions, they needed evidence that existed independently of memory, emotion, or personal interest. Based on the information gathered during the opening stages of the investigation, detectives believed there was sufficient probable cause to request a search warrant for the apartment where Malik Wilkerson and Devani Wilkerson lived in Queens. Investigators believed that if the events described during the interviews had occurred there, the residents would provide the most reliable account of what had actually taken place. A judge approved the warrant within the first day of the investigation. Crime scene unit investigators entered the second-floor apartment and immediately began documenting everything exactly as they found it. Every room was photographed before anything was moved. Measurements were taken, observations were recorded, and each potential piece of evidence was carefully marked before collection. Detectives understood that preserving the scene was just as important as discovering it. As the examination continued, investigators found multiple areas inside the apartment that appeared relevant to the case. Rather than pointing to a single location, the evidence suggested that the incident had unfolded across different parts of the residence. That observation became significant because it allowed detectives to compare the physical scene with the timelines and statements they had already collected. The crime scene unit recovered numerous items for laboratory examination. Each item was cataloged and processed according to standard forensic procedures. Detectives were careful not to draw conclusions based on any single discovery. Instead, they evaluated every piece of evidence alongside witness interviews, medical findings, and the developing timeline. At the same time, investigators continued looking beyond the apartment itself. Detectives obtained additional legal authorization to examine records that could help verify the movements and communications of those involved. Phone records and related digital information became another important tool in reconstructing the hours leading up to Sheryl Outerbridge's arrival at the hospital. Unlike personal recollections, these records provided objective time markers that investigators could compare against each witness's account. As those comparisons continued, the investigation became increasingly evidence-driven. Certain details that had initially seemed uncertain were now supported by physical findings. Other parts of the original accounts proved more difficult to reconcile with the evidence detectives were documenting. Each verified fact narrowed the range of possible explanations and helped investigators distinguish between what could be confirmed and what remained unsupported. Meanwhile, another urgent priority remained unresolved. Although Devani Wilkerson was already in police custody, Malik Wilkerson had not been located. Detectives believed speaking with him was essential to understanding the events they were reconstructing. As local investigators focused on processing the apartment, other members of the investigative team began searching for Malik's whereabouts. The investigation had now entered a very different phase. It was no longer centered on conflicting interviews alone. Detectives had a documented crime scene, growing forensic evidence, and independently verifiable records that were beginning to reshape their understanding of the case. The remaining question was whether they could locate the one person whose account had yet to be fully tested. That answer would soon come from hundreds of miles outside New York, sending investigators on the next stage of the case. By this stage of the investigation, detectives had moved beyond speculation. The interviews, the reconstructed timeline, and the evidence recovered during the search had given them a much clearer picture of the events surrounding Sheryl Outerbridge's final hours. The remaining challenge was to determine each person's level of involvement and ensure that every conclusion was supported by evidence. Investigators returned to Devani Wilkerson for another interview. Unlike the earlier conversations, this interview was more direct. Detectives now had independent evidence they could use to compare against her previous statements. As the questioning continued, parts of her account began to change. According to investigators, Devani acknowledged that the relationship involving herself, Malik Wilkerson, and Sheryl had become increasingly unstable. She described growing jealousy within the relationship and admitted that tensions had been building for weeks before the incident. Her updated account provided detectives with important context that had not been disclosed during the initial interviews. Even so, investigators continued treating every statement with caution, and admission alone was not enough. Each claim had to be measured against witness testimony, physical evidence, and the timeline they had already established. Their goal remained the same: determine what could be independently verified. While detectives continued interviewing Devani, another team focused on locating Malik Wilkerson. By then, he had left New York, making his whereabouts a priority for investigators. Working with additional law enforcement agencies, detectives obtained legal authorization to track information connected to his phone and vehicle. The investigation soon produced its first major lead. License plate recognition technology indicated that Malik's vehicle had been detected in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. That information was quickly shared with local authorities and members of a regional fugitive task force. From that point forward, the search became a coordinated effort involving investigators from more than one jurisdiction. After narrowing down his location, officers moved in to make the arrest. On the 7th of December 2013, just days after the investigation began, Malik Wilkerson was taken into custody in Pittsburgh without further incident. Detectives had secured the second key figure in the case. Following his arrest, investigators completed the legal process required to return him to New York, where he would face questioning and the charges arising from the investigation. With both central figures now in custody, detectives could finally compare their accounts against one another alongside the growing body of evidence they had assembled. The investigation had reached a decisive stage. Months of hidden tensions had led to a matter that detectives had spent days carefully reconstructing through interviews, forensic work, and verified timelines. Now, with both Malik and Devani under the authority of New York investigators, attention shifted from locating those involved to determining exactly what the evidence could prove. With both Malik Wilkerson and Devani Wilkerson in custody, the investigation moved from the hands of detectives to the court system. Prosecutors now faced the task of presenting a case that reflected what investigators believed had occurred, while ensuring the charges aligned with the available evidence. From the beginning, prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated that Sheryl Outerbridge had been forcibly returned to the Wilkerson residence and unlawfully restrained there. The case relied on a combination of witness statements, physical evidence recovered during the investigation, admissions made during interviews, and the timeline detectives had spent days reconstructing. It is important to distinguish between allegations and proven facts. At this stage, the prosecution's theory represented allegations that would need to be proven in court. Investigators believed the evidence supported those claims, but under the legal system, neither Malik nor Devani could be considered guilty unless they admitted responsibility or were convicted through judicial proceedings. As prosecutors prepared their case, defense attorneys evaluated the evidence against their clients. One challenge facing the prosecution involved the question of intent. Based on the facts uncovered during the investigation, prosecutors ultimately focused on charges that they believed could be supported by the evidence available. Rather than pursuing a lengthy trial with uncertain outcomes, discussions began regarding plea agreements. In June 2014, Devani Wilkerson agreed to plead guilty to kidnapping-related charges connected to Sheryl Outerbridge's death. By entering a guilty plea, she formally accepted criminal responsibility for her role in the events that led to the case. The plea eliminated the need for a jury trial and ensured that the matter would proceed directly to sentencing. Approximately 1 year later, Malik Wilkerson also entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping and assault-related charges, arising from the same incident. Like Devani's plea, this represented a legal admission of responsibility and avoided a full trial. These guilty pleas marked an important distinction in the case. Investigators no longer relied solely on witness statements or physical evidence to establish involvement. Both defendants had now accepted responsibility through formal court proceedings. When sentencing was ultimately imposed, the court considered the facts of the case, the defendant's admissions, and the recommendations presented through the plea agreements. A judge sentenced both Malik Wilkerson and Devani Wilkerson to 20 years in prison. The sentence brought a measure of legal closure, but reactions varied among those affected by the case. Some individuals who knew Sheryl felt the punishment did not fully reflect the loss suffered by her family and loved ones. Others focused on the fact that both defendants had been held accountable through the criminal justice system. For Sheryl's family, however, no court decision could undo what had happened. The proceedings had established legal responsibility, and the sentencing had concluded the criminal case. But the impact of Sheryl Outerbridge's loss would continue long after the courtroom process came to an end. When the legal proceedings came to an end, the headlines gradually faded. Court filings were archived, news coverage slowed, and the investigation reached its conclusion. But for those who knew Sheryl Outerbridge, the loss was never measured by court dates or legal documents. To her family, she was first and foremost a daughter, a mother, and someone who wanted a stable future for her children. Friends remembered her as caring, resilient, and deeply committed to the people she loved. Long before her name became associated with a criminal case, she had been building a life, maintaining friendships, and looking ahead to what she hoped would be better days. Those closest to Sheryl have spoken about the lasting impact her absence left on her children, relatives, and friends. While the justice system determined legal responsibility, it could never replace the role she played in the lives of the people who loved her. This case also serves as a reminder of how complicated relationship-related investigations can become. Detectives did not reach their conclusions based on assumptions or rumors. They relied on interviews, verified timelines, forensic examination, documentary evidence, and the legal process to establish what could be proven in court. The outcome was shaped by evidence, not speculation. Relationship homicides rarely begin with one isolated moment. As this investigation showed, they are often preceded by unresolved conflicts, hidden relationships, escalating tensions, and decisions that build over time. Recognizing those patterns is important not because every difficult relationship ends in tragedy, but because addressing conflict early and seeking support can prevent situations from becoming increasingly dangerous. Today, Sheryl Outerbridge should be remembered for more than the circumstances that brought her name into the public eye. She was a real person whose life mattered long before this case, and whose story continues to remind us why every victim deserves to be remembered with dignity, accuracy, and respect. The investigation into Sheryl Outerbridge's death reminds us that the truth is rarely uncovered through a single interview or one piece of evidence. It emerges through careful police work, forensic analysis, verified timelines, and a justice system that weighs facts above speculation. Sheryl's story deserves to be remembered with dignity and respect. If you value evidence-driven true crime documentaries that prioritize accuracy over rumors, subscribe and join our community. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing real cases with the care they deserve.